there are only so many different facets of your own personality that you can get to, and you find yourself repeating yourself, so it's...
Johnny Carson once sent shivers through America when he confessed that during The Tonight Show's golden era, there were 9 guests who turned him into a hostage live on air. They were branded nymphos for behavior far beyond the line. One charged onto the set like a hunter on the prowl. Another flaunted unchecked desire. One treated marriage like scrap paper. And there was even someone who needed a new pair of arms for every night. 1. Steve McQueen, the fierce race for every line of dialogue. Next on Paul Newman's hated list is Steve McQueen, the king of cool, a defiant and extremely impulsive person. On screen, they were co-stars in The Towering Inferno, 1974. But off-camera, Newman and McQueen considered each other a thorn in their side. What happened behind the scenes of that film became one of the most bitter standoffs in Hollywood history. From the very beginning of the script, McQueen refused to be outdone. He demanded the role of the firefighter instead of the architect simply because the character was cooler. Not stopping there, McQueen also forced the producers to add 12 more lines of dialogue just to equal Newman's count. A producer at the time admitted he was counting his lines like he was counting sheep before bed. It was crazy. The feud escalated when both were paid $1 million plus a percentage of the box office revenue, and their names were billed in a staggered but equal manner on the poster. Paul Newman, of course, was not happy with this arrangement. The two argued to the point that he called McQueen a chicken shit. From then on, McQueen openly expressed his dissatisfaction with Newman, and they didn't even look at each other on the red carpet. According to a lighting assistant who recounted the story during a fiery scene, Newman unexpectedly slipped on firefighting foam and almost fell to the ground. McQueen was standing right next to him. Instead of lending a hand, he ignored him, leaving Newman to get up on his own amidst the hot lights. The tense atmosphere continued to erupt even after the film's release. At a press conference, McQueen sarcastically said of Newman, "If I acted as smugly as Paul, I wouldn't even need to act to be a star." Newman retaliated with a deadly jab. "If my ego was as big as Steve's, there probably wouldn't be room for anyone else in the frame." From then on, they swore they would never be in a film together again. However, that confrontation was not the darkest chapter in Newman's list of grievances. While the rivalry was only about lines of dialogue, the next name on the list evokes a completely different kind of contempt. 2. Frank Sinatra, violent and destructive. Frank Sinatra literally terrified Paul Newman. His violent nature meant he was ready to get into a brawl and was not afraid to use his fists. He even had a list of victims, those who dared to upset him and who had to pay with their blood, and even begged Sinatra to save their lives. In 1947, Sinatra flat out attacked journalist Lee Mortimer right outside Hollywood's Kairos Club, simply because Mortimer had dared to write a critical article about Sinatra's shady relationship with the mafia. The result, he punched to Mortimer's left ear, which made him collapse in the street. The incident made headlines and then ended with an out-of-court settlement. But the scary thing was that afterward, Mortimer was confronted by strange shadows who told him, "Drop the lawsuit if you don't want to disappear." 20 years later in Las Vegas in 1967, in a fit of rage, Sinatra lunged at Carl Cohen, the owner of a famous hotel. He threw a table and chairs, turning the luxurious room into a battlefield. Cohen retaliated with a fatal punch that knocked out Sinatra's dentures. In 1966, Sinatra was even accused of throwing a telephone at Frederick Wiseman, which fractured the man's skull and put him in the hospital for 2 days. Sinatra's erratic temper became his trademark. He would yell at the crew, throw wine glasses at colleagues, and even toss food at waiters just for a glance he didn't like. Sinatra himself once admitted, "My mouth is too fast, and my fists are too fast." But Sinatra was untouchable. He was the king of Las Vegas, whom everyone had to be wary of. The mob bosses saw Sinatra as their trump card, ready to cover up any scandal just to keep him singing. Paul Newman looked at all of this with cold indifference. To him, Sinatra was the embodiment of everything bad in the world, violence and brawling. Once, when asked about the Rat Pack, Newman said concisely, "His way of life is a stain." Newman viewed Sinatra as a gangster in a suit. Conversely, Sinatra never hid his contempt for self-righteous people like Newman, whom he saw as fake, playing a respectable role just to win over the public. However, Hollywood was not only filled with hotheads. Out there was another kind of power, and it was much more intense. 3. Marlon Brando, The Secret of Party Nights and 10 Lovers. Compared to Newman's calm demeanor, Marlon Brando was the complete opposite, a genius actor, but also a libertine with the nickname Hunter of Colored Women. Indeed, Brando entered Hollywood like a storm. With a streetcar named Desire, he redefined acting with his brilliant performances. But behind the lights, his personal life was a nightmare for film crews. His personality smelled of sulfur. He cursed, spat, and was ready to punch through a studio mirror if he was not happy. Once he fell over drunk and vomited right before the cameras were about to roll. Paul Newman had the bad luck of witnessing this, and according to him, it was a sight I will never forget. And it smelled so bad I almost fainted on the spot. Brando had 3 legal wives, but the number that shocked Hollywood was his fleeting affairs. Brando could sleep with 10 models at once, and even with actresses, dancers, and beautiful fans he had just met a few hours before. Directors were very troubled by this issue, and they complained Brando might leave the set with a half-finished script, but he will definitely bring a brown girl with him. But what truly rocked Hollywood were Brando's gay relationships. He once publicly stated that he was not limited, and many sources say he slept with James Dean Rock Hudson and even Marvin Gaye. This earned him both praise for his audacity and public scorn. For Newman, who was disciplined and extremely loyal to Joanne Woodward, Brando was everything he hated. And then, Brando had to pay a heavy price for his dissolute lifestyle. In his final years, he weighed over 330 pounds, was in a wheelchair due to obesity, diabetes, and heart failure. His swollen face and cloudy eyes were the legacy of decades spent immersed in alcohol, cigarettes, and lust. To Newman, Brando's tragedy was a living testament to self-irresponsibility. Brando had chosen the opposite path, and his end was nothing short of an indictment of the longest self-destruction in history. 4. John Wayne, a man from the last century. The next person on Paul Newman's list of rivals is John Wayne the Giant on horseback, embodying a strong, loud, conservative man who was absolutely loyal to the traditional American dream. In Wayne's eyes, Newman was not just an anti-hero, but a danger to American culture. He played roles that were too subtle, too vulnerable, and eroded the traditional masculine image that Wayne revered. To Wayne, a real man should be loud, strong, and never allowed to cry. Wayne once openly mocked Newman. Paul Newman would be more prominent if he stopped playing anti-hero roles and learned to be a real American man. The tension also erupted in politics. Newman was one of the rare Hollywood stars who was put on President Nixon's enemies list for his anti-war activism and support for liberal organizations. Conversely, Wayne was the strongest voice of the conservative side, always viewing anti-war movements as treason. And Wayne was an active member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, the organization that hunted for communists in Hollywood. He vehemently opposed artists suspected of being pro-communist, even calling for them to be boycotted and removed from the film industry. When reporters asked Newman what he thought of Wayne, he coldly replied, "I'm not interested in working with people who live in the last century." John Wayne was not to be outdone, hinting that Newman was an embarrassment to cinema. Although they never directly confronted each other at major events, when Newman entered the room, Wayne would immediately turn away and refuse to look at him. Once at an Oscar party, Wayne was sitting at a table across from Newman. Throughout the evening, Wayne would aggressively tap his cigar on the ashtray, his eyes never leaving Newman, as if to say, "You don't belong in this world." Newman just gave a faint smile, raised his glass, and turned to talk to Jane Fonda, the anti-war icon whom Wayne hated with a passion. The conflict between Newman and Wayne was not merely a personal feud, but a battle of ideologies, one side clinging to a conservative past, the other aspiring for freedom and humanism. In Newman's eyes, John Wayne was a relic of an outdated era. To Wayne Paul, Newman was a destroyer of the cowboy dream he had dedicated his life to building. 5. James Dean, living and dying like a madman. In the early years of his career, Paul Newman once auditioned for East of Eden, 1955. But when he entered the casting room, he received bad news. The role had already gone to James Dean, the 24-year-old, with a defiant gaze, messy hair, sloppy clothes, who rarely bathed and spent more time hanging out in car garages than on a film set. East of Eden was a huge success, turning Dean into an icon. Newman, sitting in a cramped rented room in New York, quietly looked at the poster on the street and thought bitterly, "That could have been me." From that moment on, Hollywood journalists turned every comparison into a stab at him. Dean was hailed as a natural-born genius, while Newman was labeled a less intense copy. But what Newman most despised was Dean's reckless lifestyle. He had an obsessive love for speed driving, first a Porsche 356 Speedster, and then a Porsche 550 Spider, the car he named Little Bastard. Despite warnings from friends and Warner Bros., Dean would secretly participate in road races. Newman once told his friends, "Dean drove like a madman, living as if he would die tomorrow." And he did. Dean also didn't hide his ambition to live fast and burn brightly. His famous quote, "Live fast, die young, and leave a good-looking corpse," was nothing short of a prophecy. And indeed, a horrific accident at the end of 1955 took Dean's life at just 24 years old. Paradoxically, that death sealed Dean's legendary status. He forever remained 24 years old. Newman continued to live and work, but was always subjected to comparisons. Dean was the rebellious icon, while Newman was just the safe alternative. James Dean ignored all the rules, challenged all of Hollywood, indulged in speed love affairs, and pleasure living up to his live fast, die young credo. That very recklessness turned him into an immortal symbol of rebellious youth, and also made the name James Dean forever linked to the tragic death in the silver Porsche Little Bastard. In Newman's eyes, James Dean was an undeserving but worshipped person, a genius who was mythologized just because he died young. 6. Robert Redford, a friend who became an enemy. When Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid 1969 was released, audiences hailed it as a masterpiece. But few people know that behind the dazzling lights, there was an irreparable crack. Paul Newman was jealous of Robert Redford. Newman was already an established star. Redford, on the other hand, was just a rising star, but quickly captivated the attention of young audiences. Rumors from behind the scenes said that Newman was annoyed when the camera lingered on Redford for too long, when the lights shone more brightly on Redford, and when Redford's name began to echo in movie theaters. Once in a joint interview, when a reporter asked, "Is Redford the next Paul Newman?" Newman squeezed his glass, his eyes icy, and replied curtly, "No, he is who he is. I am who I am." Redford, on the other hand, never hid his respect for Newman, but also wasn't afraid to use the comparison to advance faster. In the 1970s, with The Sting, Redford's name appeared before Newman's in many articles. That imbalance quietly pushed Newman into a state of bitterness. From being the top star, he became someone who had to share the spotlight. Newman once confided in a close friend, "Redford didn't steal anything from me, but he took away the monopoly I once had." In Newman's eyes, Redford was a talented colleague, but also an uncomfortable shadow, both close to him and constantly making him feel compared. They didn't have loud arguments or insult each other in the press, but that very silence was the clearest proof of their animosity. Two legends side by side, but Newman's gaze always held bitterness. Hollywood preserves their image as a classic on-screen duo, but behind the bright poster, it was a story of a star who had reached the peak and another star who was just rising, making the sky so crowded that Newman felt suffocated. In another direction, Newman also encountered a type of person who was even more unpleasant, someone who turned acting something he considered a subtle art into a theatrical display. 7. Dustin Hoffman. Acting that was over the top and fake. If Paul Newman was the embodiment of disciplined acting, then Dustin Hoffman represented the opposite school of thought, explosive, extreme, and sometimes over the top. And it was that contrast that made Hoffman a name that irritated Newman among the new generation of actors. When The Graduate 1967 was released, Hoffman became a phenomenon. He didn't have a star look like Newman or Redford. He was short, had a hooked nose and a normal appearance, but he used that very difference to create his appeal. The press called Hoffman a breath of fresh air in Hollywood, someone who dared to break the standards of beauty. When Newman read those lines, he coldly remarked, "He didn't break anything. He's just putting on a show." Newman was known for his calm approach to acting, letting emotion seep into his eyes, voice, and every small movement. In contrast, Hoffman followed the extreme method acting school, starving himself, staying up all night, and obsessing over his character to the point of turning the film set into a psychological experiment. To Newman, that wasn't acting. It was a cheap spectacle. Once when asked about Hoffman, Newman bitingly replied, "Acting is not about turning yourself into a living corpse in real life." Hollywood gossip tells that at a charity party, Newman and Hoffman once stood at the same table. While Hoffman went on and on about living as the character for weeks on end, Newman just sipped his wine, then cut him off. "I call that delusion. You call it art. But the audience doesn't care." The room went silent. Hoffman blushed, and Newman turned and walked away. In Newman's eyes, Hoffman was proof of the abuse of acting methods, turning it into a spectacle instead of something with depth. In Hoffman's eyes, Newman was an outdated person, a handsome star who relied on his blue eyes and classic look. Their two perspectives never met, only creating an ever-widening gap. And so between two generations of talent, a silent but sharp rift existed. Newman disdained Hoffman for showing off, while Hoffman disdained Newman for being old-fashioned. Hollywood never saw them collaborate, nor did it ever hear a reconciliation. Because for Newman, Dustin, Hoffman was never worth more than a dismissive frown. 8. Charlton Heston, the face of violence and guns. If Paul Newman is remembered as a progressive artist who spent his life fighting for human rights, anti-war causes, and environmental protection, Charlton Heston is the quintessential face of the conservative side, a Hollywood giant who later became the president of the National Rifle Association, NRA. Newman was put on President Nixon's enemies list for his anti-war activism. He called for peace donated to civil rights movements and publicly supported leftist candidates. In Heston's eyes, that was an act of betrayal. Heston believed that America needed toughness guns and discipline, and he was willing to stand on a podium holding a rifle and shouting, "From my cold, dead hands." The confrontation became fierce in public debates. Once, when Newman criticized the U.S. government for stealing youth with a pointless war in Vietnam, Heston immediately responded to the press. Those words weakened the national spirit. An actor can entertain but don't do politics if you don't understand the price of freedom. Newman did not stay silent. He said, "Freedom is not a gun. It is the right to live, to speak, and not to die meaninglessly on a battlefield." Hollywood was divided into two camps. One side praised Heston as a protector of traditional American values, while the other sided with Newman as a symbol of conscience and progress. Whenever they appeared at the same event, the atmosphere was as tense as a wire. It is said that at a charity party, Newman and Heston sat at opposite ends of a long table. Neither said a word, but their gazes were like two knives enough to make the entire room drop a few degrees. In Newman's eyes, Heston was the embodiment of the America he wanted to change, conservative, hawkish, and carrying the dark shadow of violence. In Heston's eyes, Newman was a delusional artist, someone who used his fame to spread what he saw as weakness. Although Hollywood once built them up as on-screen heroes, it preserves the memory of them as two giants standing at opposite ends of a battlefield, spending their lives fighting each other. Why did Paul Newman a symbol of peace? Hate these men on the surface. Paul Newman was the role model any artist would aspire to be: calm, kind, and compassionate. He was married to Joanne Woodward for over half a century, a rare feat in a Hollywood known for its scandals. He donated hundreds of millions of dollars to charities' open summer camps for sick children and sided with the vulnerable in political campaigns. In the public's eyes, Newman was not just an actor, but a moral icon, a lighthouse shining in a sea of scandal. But behind that light, Newman was still a man of flesh and blood, and that man carried bitterness, jealousy, contempt, and even hatred. The truth is, Newman lived in a Hollywood filled with things he rejected: violence, depravity, extreme conservatism, and loud men who only used their fists or affairs to assert themselves. And the more Newman kept his image clean, the more he felt disgusted by being in the same atmosphere as them. He didn't hate them for their talent; many of them were true geniuses. But Newman despised how they used that talent, turning it into a tool to serve their ego, their lust, or their dirty political games. On set, he kept silent, but in private conversations, Newman often revealed an icy gaze when talking about colleagues he considered traitors to art. What made Newman's hatred so special was its paradoxical nature. He was a man who fought for peace and opposed violence, but he also harbored a silent war against the people he despised. Newman called for tolerance, but deep down, he never forgave those who turned Hollywood into a cesspool of lust and ambition. He spoke of compassion, but sometimes Newman himself allowed contempt to control his gaze. During the peak of his career, Newman had to witness his colleagues being praised just for dying young for their depravity, or for a few punches to a reporter's face. He saw those men become legends in the public's eyes while he had to sweat maintain discipline, and was still put in an unfair position of comparison. This very paradox was the source of his hatred. He didn't just hate them, but he hated the society that mythologized them. And so, Paul Newman, the symbol of peace, also became a man who carried another kind of war within him, a war against the ugliness of Hollywood, against the dirty power he despised, and against the fake glory that the public adored. He was not loud, he didn't brawl, he didn't curse. He was just silent, but that silence was filled with bitterness, like a wound that never heals. And perhaps that is the tragedy and the truth that made Newman who he was. He is remembered as a symbol of peace, but the truth is, he could only become that symbol by harboring hatred for everything that was the opposite. Without that hatred, perhaps Newman would not have had a reason to keep himself clean to the very end. One life fighting for human rights, but also one life living with animosity. A man admired for his morals, but also someone who knew how to be contemptuous and jealous. That is the real Paul Newman, not a saint on the screen, but a human being who was both noble and full of cracks. And it is those very cracks that make his light unforgettable. Newman the Misfit Star. When people mention Paul Newman, they often remember his deep blue eyes that could move people and make his rivals wary. But his legacy is not just on the screen. It's broader, more complex, both brilliant and full of cracks, a mirror reflecting Hollywood and America in the 20th century. In the late 1950s, when Hollywood was flooded with macho cowboy or perfect hero archetypes, Paul Newman appeared on screen as a contradiction. He chose characters with flaws, with vulnerability, even failure, but from that, audiences saw the light of truth. In Cool Hand Luke, he was an indomitable prisoner who fought against the system, failing but not yielding. In The Hustler, he was a talented pool player who fell into obsession and mistakes. These roles made Newman the face of the anti-hero, a type of character that went against the traditional heroic mold, but which touched a deeper human truth. That is part of his cinematic legacy. Newman expanded the concept of masculinity on screen from muscular and perfect to complex, vulnerable, but full of character. While many of his contemporaries went downhill with alcohol, drugs, and affairs, Newman chose a different path. He maintained his marriage to Joanne Woodward for over 50 years, a rare miracle in scandal-plagued Hollywood. He didn't hide that he liked racing cars and drinking beer, but he never let his instincts ruin his career and family. This created an image that was in complete opposition to the rebel stars of his time. In a Hollywood drowning in hard liquor, drugs, and one-night stands, Newman appeared as an exception. He proved that in Hollywood, you can be both a great artist and a decent human being. That is what made Newman a freak in the eyes of many of his colleagues, someone who seemed unwilling to be swept away by his instincts, always putting discipline and morality first. If you feel that the story still has gaps, it's not a mistake. What has been told is just the shiny facade painted on by spotlights, praise, and applause. But behind that mask is another face full of cracks, fears, and dark corners that have never been exposed. A legend is never just created by glamour. It is forged in the shadows, from long, lonely nights, bitter compromises, to silent battles that no outsider could ever understand. Every smiling eye on the screen often conceals a wound. Every applause in the auditorium often brings back an unnamed obsession. There are truths that seem to have decayed with time, lying dormant under layers of dust. But just a leftover piece of paper, a whispered story from behind the scenes, is enough to shake everything. And when those cracks are no longer concealed, a chilling question arises: have we never seen the real legend, but only looked at a theatrical curtain with an abyss behind it that has never seen the light? Promise until the end of his life. Since its inception, Newman's Own has donated over $500 million to orphanages, children's cancer hospitals, and anti-poverty organizations. No other Hollywood star has ever dared to turn their private company into a true charitable machine like that. In the public's eyes, Newman was not just an actor, but an ethical businessman, a person who used the light of his fame to warm the lives of those in the dark. But Newman's legacy is not all light. Like any human being, he had his cracks. Behind the calm blue eyes and decent roles, Newman harbored a long list of colleagues he despised. To Newman, Marlon Brando was a depraved genius, a man who sold his soul to lust. John Wayne was a monument to extreme conservatism, using the cowboy image to glorify war and racism. Frank Sinatra was a violent rat pack mobster who used his fists to assert power. James Dean was a reckless man, living fast and dying young, but who was overly mythologized. Robert Redford was a young shadow who always reminded Newman of the fragility of his own star status. The irony is that a man who fought for peace and called for tolerance also harbored silent wars and never forgave those he considered traitors to art. Newman publicly called on humanity to learn to understand and forgive. But in Hollywood, he made no secret of his contempt for those who opposed the discipline and character he revered. In fact, that very contempt is also part of his legacy. It made Newman a real person, not a fake saint. He was not perfect. He also knew jealousy, bitterness, and could coldly turn his back on his colleagues. But that is what made Newman more relatable, more alive. If he were only light, he would be a distant icon. But with those cracks, Newman became a mirror reflecting an entire generation. Light only has meaning when it shines on darkness. Perhaps the greatest legacy Newman left behind is not just his immortal roles or his huge charitable donations, but it is a paradox, a symbol of peace, who had to carry hatred within him to stay clean. He was like a silent soldier, fighting not only against injustice out there, but also against what he considered evil within his own world. And that silent battle, though full of bitterness, made Newman more real, and therefore more immortal. If you feel that the story still has gaps, it's not a mistake. What has been told is just the shiny facade painted on by spotlights, praise, and applause. But behind that mask is another face full of cracks, fears, and dark corners that have never been exposed. A legend is never just created by glamour. It is forged in the shadows from long, lonely nights, bitter compromises to silent battles that no outsider could ever understand. Every smiling eye on the screen often conceals a wound. Every applause in the auditorium often brings back an unnamed obsession. There are truths that seem to have decayed with time, lying dormant under layers of dust. But just a leftover piece of paper, a whispered story from behind the scenes, is enough to shake everything. And when those cracks are no longer concealed, a chilling question arises: have we never seen the real legend, but only looked at a theatrical curtain with an abyss behind it?